Welcome to Wine Soundtrack International. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world. In 30 answers, discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. Benvenuti. This is Alison Levine, and today I'm with Roberto Stucchi Prenetti. He is the owner and winemaker of Badia a Coltibuono from Chianti Classico in Tuscany, Italy. Roberto, welcome and tell us about Badia a Coltibuono.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me here. So, Badia Coltibuono is a historical winery located in central Tuscany, in the zone of Chianti Classico, the comune of Gaiolo in Chianti, precisely, which is the southern part of Chianti Classico. And it's a very historical property because it has its roots back in the Middle Ages. Basically, monks founded the monastery in 1051, and they've always made wine there from the beginning, and the monks were living and running the place up till Napoleon's time in 1810, at which time Napoleon annexed Tuscany and secularized the monastery and kicked them out, and there were 3 owners, and then our ancestors bought it in 1846, so it's been quite a while in the family, but after Second World War, my father started developing the wine production, bring it in the modern era, and so we took it over from there, and now we make obviously Chianti Classico, very traditional classic wines. Everything organic for a long time, now over 20 years. We also have what's called an agriturismo, farm holidays, a restaurant, cooking courses. So a lot of fun things if you come and visit. And this is, in a nutshell, is what the place is about.
Well, fantastic. Now, you said you're producing Chianti Classico, but obviously that's a place. And so if you can tell our listeners a little bit about that Sangiovese, but are you growing any other grapes? And what's your total acreage, or hectares, I should say?
Yeah, we have about 65 hectares, so it should be 150 acres more or less of vineyards in production, all in Chianti Classico, and primarily Sangiovese, but we like to do it in the traditional way, which means it's blended with other complementary varietals that are traditional of the area. So Chianti Classico was always Sangiovese, but always field blended with up to 130 different varietals. So we only grow a few of those, but we still like to maintain some of those in the mix. But only Tuscan varietals that have their roots and their origins there, because that's what makes Chianti unique and special.
And what is your total case production?
We do about 25,000 cases of the state wines, and more or less. So we're not large, but we're not small, it's kind of a...
Well, you're able to have a reach. So with your reach, where are your wines available outside of Italy?
Well, the U.S. is our biggest market, so actually we have a pretty good distribution around the States, and where I come quite often to promote the wines. And then most of the European countries, Canada, Japan, a few other countries around the world, but the U.S. is a big part of it.
And you speak very good English because you studied here, right?
I studied in California way back many, many years ago. I was 2.5 years in winemaking program at University of California in Davis. I worked in Napa Valley for a year, but this was way back in the 80s. So before starting to take over the winery and manage the Badia a Coltibuono winery.
So before you started studying wine, you obviously grew up in the family business. What's your first memory relevant to wine?
Well, I grew up at the winery. The monastery was in the family, but I grew up in Milano, in the city, about 3 hours away. So that was a sort of a magical place where I'd go in the summer and, playing in the forest and whatnot. In terms of wine, I fell in love with wine later, a lot later. I started studying agriculture with the idea of producing food. My first passion was food, not wine. Wine came a little bit later, but I was cooking already at 5 or 6.
Wow.
And I've cooked pretty much all my life, a lot. So, my passion came from food, definitely. And so then, in my late teens, I kind of took the first vision of the wine and started. But I also learned to enjoy wine outside of the house, so not so much Chianti, but when I started going out in Milano as
just drinking wine.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And so, obviously, wine was a part of your life from your childhood, whether or not your family was in the business. It's just more of a part of the Italian lifestyle on the table. But as you got into wine, you obviously have had the opportunity to drink a lot of really great wines. Is there a particular wine, one of those aha moments that you had, a particular wine that set you on a path maybe, at one point of your career or another? And do you remember what that wine was? Or maybe there were two.
With wine and food, I'm very omnivorous, so I like really all kinds of wine, all kinds of food. And, I don't have a particular moment that it kind of grew gradually. And so I started enjoying it more and more and learning more about it. And so not a specific wine, just gradually building up enthusiasm for it. So
never one of those wines you opened where you just said, wow.
Many, but not one specific. And of course, it also has to do with the moment. Some of my favorite wine memories were not necessarily great wines, but it was great moments or great company. So, and sometimes that overcomes, the quality of the wine. So, I came to California to study wine in my early 20s, and this is also where I learned a lot about the farming, and particularly about organic farming, which is a big thing for us. We've been organic now for many, many years. And many of my teachers were around California. I used to come selling wine later every year and visiting farms here. So I have a strong connection to California, and I learned a lot here.
So if we were to come to your home and go into your cellar, what would we find in there? Your personal cellar?
Whatever it's whatever at the moment is. It tends to be more Italian wines. In Italy, you don't find much. Certainly not many California wines. So I'll have occasionally bottles because somebody that visits brings something over. But generally, more Tuscan wines. But just because of lack of time, I would love to spend more time. Tasting, drinking, whatever. I just spend too much time with my own wine. So I figured in the next life, maybe I'll be on the other side and to be able to enjoy more of a variety of wines than now. But I like wines generally that are a little bit more elegant, lighter. I mean, my palate is formed in Chianti, so I'm not necessarily a huge fan of very big, robust, oaky wines, but sometimes I can enjoy them, but that's not my favorite style.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Was there any particular wine you opened recently, whether it was yours or another, that drank really well?
Well, just a few days ago, I visited with my friends in Northern California that I see every year, and I always bring a bottle of wine from California. And so and I managed to find something a little bit unusual. So a Grignolino from Napa Valley.
Really?
Okay, yeah.
Wow.
Very nice contrast. So a very light, almost pink wine, very fresh, very crisp, but from, one of the classic producers in Napa. So I was like, I like the contrast. Ooh. And
who was the producer? I'm curious.
Actually, Heights, believe it or not.
A Grignolino, wow.
Yeah. And it was kind of a study in contrasts because, obviously Heights makes some classic Napa cabs, pretty massive and so on. And this instead was very much the opposite, more like an Italian Grignolino, even though it's just different. It's still Napa in some way, but
that's fascinating.
So that was fun.
Wow.
It was good advice from a wine shop that I visited.
Yeah. It's hard enough to find Grignolino in Italy.
It is.
So, do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
Well, I'm biased. I'm biased for Sangiovese because I've always worked with Sangiovese. And, I'm going to make my pitch for Sangiovese, I find it's really exceptional because of how adaptable it is, because of how it changes, how it's capable of expressing the place really, really strongly, to the point where sometimes it's hard to recognize that a wine is Sangiovese because depending on the soil microclimate and how it's handled, it can really go in many directions. And sometimes in the past, many people consider that a limit because it didn't have a very strong identity. But to me, that's a plus because it has more of an identity of the place. So, but there again, I am biased. That's what I do. So,
well, that's okay. Everyone has their bias, right? So on the note of bias, what's your opinion of wine critics and scores?
Well, I've never been a fan of scores just because, it's I make wine, so nobody likes to, not to have the best score ever. And also I think I'm more interested in understanding the differences and being appreciated for the specifics of the wine. I'm happier if some wine critic or somebody appreciates the uniqueness of the wine, even more than if they give me a really high rating, which of course I like, but I don't complain if they do. But I'm very happy if they say, you can really taste the place or something like that. To me, it's even more significant, more important.
Absolutely. So let's talk about you as a consumer of wine. Red, white, or rosé?
99% red. Yeah, but I like almost any wine. It's like with food. I've never found a wine that's good that I don't like. So it's definitely one of the fun things. Red, generally not too big. I like some crispness in my wines because I like to have it with food. So a little bit of acidity I find is nice.
Well, let's talk about food. How do you approach food and wine pairing? Do you think there are rules that have to be followed, or you cook a lot, so obviously, you have a lot more experience of playing around and experimenting, but are there things you look for when you're pairing food and wine, or rules that you think hold true?
Well, there are many rules, but I don't really follow them very much. So it's like whatever wine I have, whatever food I have, that's my rule for pairing it. What I feel like having and what I'm cooking or somebody else is cooking or whatever. So then I've been more into it maybe over the years, but now I'm much more direct in terms of it. It doesn't really matter all that much. I can separate. If it's not a perfect pairing, it doesn't matter. But if I want that wine, I'll still have it. So sometimes it's going to be red wine with seafood. And plus, we also have a tradition in Tuscany, but I would say in most of Italy, where you tend to have some local wine predominantly, and you'll have it with anything. So, and particularly in Tuscany, 90% is red in central Tuscany, and so you'd have that, whether it's seafood or a steak. So now, of course, it's changed, and there are more white wines around Tuscany and everything. But that's kind of where we come from as a tradition and a culture. So,
but as you were saying, a wine with acidity can probably pair with just about anything.
Yeah, that helps. And going back to Sangiovese is very food friendly. So it's not overwhelming where you need to really have the perfect pairing. It does go with a variety of foods, and then again, it depends what type of Sangiovese. If you go to a very rich Chianti Classico Riserva or Brunello di Montalcino or something like that, then you might want something a little bit richer, meat or red meat or something. But with lighter Chianti Classicos or things that are not, or Rosso di Montalcino, just to stay in Tuscany, you can have it easily even on a pasta or even a salad, and it's very enjoyable anyway.
So for somebody who hasn't had the pleasure to taste your wines yet, what do you think they're missing out on?
Oh, you have to taste them. They're like Chianti is very special because of its diversity. So it's a fairly large area, very diverse in terms of altitude, microclimates, soils, and so it's and there's a lot of different interpretations from the different producers. And also because it's usually, or it can be, a blend of different varietals. This means that you have a lot of different styles. With my wines, you have a very classic style Chianti Classico, so not overwhelmingly rich, but very crisp, food-friendly, approachable, but also age-worthy, and it's a good example of a modern wine that has maintained its root and its character, which to me is something that's important, because wines should have some sense of where they come from and of the place, and of what makes that place and that wine unique.
So if space aliens were to land on your property, which of your wines would you want to present to them?
I would ask them what they usually drink.
What if they were leaving it just to you to pick?
Probably in the end, my favorite wine is the Chianti Classico Annata, which is sort of the entry-level wine of the Chianti Classico, but also because it's the fresher one, the one that you can have with almost anything, lunch, dinner, an important meal, or something simple. It's really good for just a glass of wine when you want something casual. And so I think that would be probably the one to go to.
Absolutely. Well, and it's also a good introduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were tasting through some of your wines earlier and tasted different vintages, and you were telling me about how 2007 was a very hot vintage and 2008 was, not a hot vintage, but had some challenges. How different do you see vintage to vintage, or do you think there are things that sort of repeat themselves?
No, there are consistent differences, and Sangiovese expresses the differences a lot. The style of wine that I make embraces the difference. I like the fact that each vintage tastes differently. And also what's very significant is that the climate has changed drastically. So when I started, we were picking in late October. Alcohol levels were barely reaching 12.5%. Now we pick in September, a month earlier, and alcohol levels are between 13 and 15% because it's so much warmer. Weather patterns have changed a lot. So we're also obviously very following closely the vintages and very aware of what's happening, because it's become so complicated and so different. So we had to change the way we grow the grapes and just learn how to adapt to very, very different conditions.
And since every year is going to give you something different, are there any signs or predictors that you look for that will give you a sense of what to expect in a year?
You do and you don't. I mean, as the season progresses, you sort of have an idea of where it's going, but then it changes. So we've had, 2018, that was a sort of a lighter year all summer. It was a little bit cooler, a few more rains than normal. So it started as a kind of a light vintage, and then suddenly mid-September it turned hot, dry, windy, and it ended up like when we started harvesting to be instead a very rich, very concentrated vintage, and this changed within the time of a week. So
no predictors.
No predictors.
Well, in terms of consistency or rituals, you've had a family winery for a long time, many hundreds of years. Are there any traditions that your family, the winery, does at the beginning of harvest or during harvest that is something that is a marker of the start or end, or?
Well, not really. Also because we're the first generation of family of doing this for a living. So, we're sort of building new traditions as we go. So there isn't a real... I actually grew up in the city, in Milano, where my father's main activity was. And so, we had feet in the very different worlds. So
have you set up any traditions now? Do you have a big meal, or do you wear a certain shirt or something for harvest?
No, I tend not to be very superstitious. So it's whatever comes. But, we also have a celebration at the end of harvest, of course, with a nice meal with everybody that's worked at harvest. But that's about it. So enough.
That's a ritual. Mm-hmm. So I know you said you're not very superstitious, but you know, a lot of winemakers, you obviously spend a lot of time, like many others, in your vineyard, walking through the vines. Do you talk to your grapes? Have you been known to?
I don't.
Is it part of an organic ethos?
No, I don't talk to the grapes. We just spend a lot of time observing the grapes, the vineyards, and also what's around. To me, one of the things about proper organic approach is not just what you do to the vines, but it's what happens between the vines, around the vineyard. So, you know, using cover crop for biodiversity, making sure you leave trees in the vicinity of the vineyard, and if there's stone walls or other elements that can, for example, host beneficial insects. So we're also careful about the larger system and not just only what happens with the vines. And so this changes a little bit how you look at things, because you have to, on the one side, concentrate and focus and look at the details, but on the other hand, also expand the vision and look at the whole and how, you know, whatever the general picture is.
Uh-huh. And so do your vines talk to you in that sense?
No, they tell me things, but without talking.
Fair enough. So, getting out of wine, when you were a little boy, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Who remembers? I think that the idea of working with growing things came very early. So I was living in a city, so my first experiments were on the balcony in little pots. And then in the summer, when I was in the country, I would, you know, play around with dirt or in the forest. So there was definitely something driving me to that from early on. But I didn't have this conscious decision where I would be this or that or a farmer or whatever. So just a general direction, let's say.
Yeah. And when you were studying and more interested in food, what were you hoping to do or thinking you would do before you diverted yourself into wine?
Well, it would have been either growing food. I've started, like, for example, keeping a vegetable garden early on, but also I was very interested in herbal medicine. So I almost went into a program in herbal medicine and possibly forestry, so, you know, in that direction. Wine, I guess I didn't really look at because it was too close to home, so it came later when I sort of allowed myself to look in that direction.
I'm glad you did, because you make very good wines. When you're not working, how do you spend your free time?
Free time?
Okay, silly question.
I don't know. I like, if possible, to be in nature, to go around, to walk. When I had more time, I used to do a fair amount of hiking, things like that. But I don't do it as much as I would like, definitely. But
Yeah. Life keeps us busy. Work. If you were planning a romantic evening for you and your wife, what sort of wines would make for a romantic evening in your home?
Well, I would have to find something that she likes particularly.
Is that difficult?
It can be. She has very peculiar taste, and so it's. You have to think about it and look around, and she doesn't spend as much time in wine as I do, so I kind of have to guess what would really work for that evening. So, but
what kind of interesting wines does she tend to like?
Well, she likes fruity, bright cherry wines. So, in fact, she probably less leaning on the style of wine that I make.
You just have to get her drinking more wine.
Yeah, more wine and different wines. So often she appreciates more wines that I bring home from others than actually my own, which makes sense, and it's totally fair. So,
well, I'm going to ask you a very controversial question, but who's your soccer team?
I'm completely not interested in soccer. I don't follow, never have.
Are you Italian?
I'm Italian, but not all Italians follow soccer. And so never really played soccer. If anything, I was playing basketball as a kid, but I don't follow basketball either. So not much interested in spectator sport, never followed it. It's something I think you grow up in, and I never grew up in. Even my father was never into sports, so I'll watch the occasional game in the World Cup, but that's as far as I go. So,
so when you think back of all the years and all the people that have influenced you, what was one of the best pieces of advice you were ever given, and who gave it to you? Something that you live your life by, or you try to.
Oh my God, many. I always kind of learn new things from different people. So. It's hard to pinpoint one. There's just layers and layers of when I was learning, and I'm still learning how to farm better. The people who do it and have been doing it for a long time have taught me a lot, but I don't have any specific names. Or
any sort of philosophies that you sort of tried to live by as advice, or advice you'd want to share with our listeners?
Well, I come from this tradition. I've been doing organic farming for a long time. I've studied biodynamic way back. I've also practiced a lot of, let's say, martial arts, especially in the Chinese tradition, and Qigong and things like that, which also have taught me a lot about, about balance, about keeping your feet solidly on the ground, and how it's important to think big, but always keeping your feet well rooted in the ground. And so very practical sort of philosophy that that I've learned through these practices, and that I find it's always useful.
But that is very good advice, to always keep your feet firmly on the ground.
Yeah. And I think these days we live in a very, sometimes almost disembodied world. We're all connected to our devices all the time, and sometimes you lose connection with the matter, body, the ground, and the more material things, and it's very important to reconnect to maintain a connection to, and it takes these days a little bit of effort, because we tend to kind of like be taken elsewhere all
Where's
the time.
my phone? When you look back at your career, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements to date in any part of your career?
Well, I'm pretty proud of what we did at Coltibuono with in terms of being having a fairly pioneer role in organic practices, in taking good care of the place, and now it's something that's become more common, but when I started following that, it was quite rare, it was challenging, and I'm very proud now because there's a lot of Chianti has converted to organic, where about 1/3 of the vineyard land is certified organic, and it's one of the percentages highest in Italy. So we're working with other producers together to expand this even more. So that's something that I'm quite proud of.
I think you should be, especially to see how many people have converted to that and continue to. I think that's a great accomplishment. So complete this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
The exception, hopefully.
So now I want you to imagine, if we're sitting here at a table, but imagine it was in a restaurant, and the paparazzi are very excited because there's someone sitting here drinking your wine. Who would you want that person to be from any walk of life?
Oh, I wouldn't have mind having Miles Davis have one of my wines and try to hear his comments.
Well, speaking of Miles Davis, I'm going to come back to that one because I have a question about music for you. But first, I'm going to ask you a question. If you had to go to a deserted island, what 3 wines would you want to take with you?
As much as I love wine, I'm not sure it's the first thing I would think of.
I didn't say it's the only thing you take to your island. Just when it comes to your wine selection, which three wines?
There would be reds, and I think because of my biases, it would be some Sangiovese, maybe some Nebbiolo, and I don't know, maybe Aglianico. It's like, and I realize I'm very, it's all Italy, but that's where I grew up, and that's my home base in terms of flavors and wines.
Yes, but those are 3 wonderful grapes from Italy, so I don't think you can go wrong. So now, going back to, you said Miles Davis, and I can actually kind of see that with having tasted through your wines, but looking at the wines in your portfolio, sometimes we think of listening to music, or it makes us, wine will give us a sensation something can be bigger or more elegant or softer, like music styles. Whether it's a style of music or a particular song or a particular artist, if I name a couple of the wines that I tasted today, if you could tell me what you'd want to be listening to or what makes you think of. And so I want to start with your Chianti Classico. As you had said earlier, it's sort of your entry level, but it's that kind of wine to have with everything. What would you want to listen to? What does it make you think of?
Well, I grew up listening a lot of classic rock, and one of my all-time favorites, and the one I listen to more often of those years, is probably Lou Reed. So, and I find it's a great artist, but with a lot of variety, and so I can sort of listen to him in many different ways, in many different occasions, and so this comes to mind. Okay.
And then you brought out a great wine called Sangiovese, which is an IGT wine that is Sangiovese. And it's a little different than the classic Chianti Classico style.
Yeah, so that's Sangiovese from older vines, only Sangiovese, which wasn't, of course, allowed for Chianti Classico in the old days. And we've made it for a long time. And there would go even more classical music for that. So I don't listen to a ton of classical music, but I don't know, some, Mozart quartets. I mean, something great, obvious, but very, very enjoyable.
And then the last wine, you have a Vinsanto, but unlike typical Vinsantos made with white grapes, you make it with Sangiovese. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that wine and what you would want to listen to.
Well, the Occhio di Pernice, which is the Vinsanto from Sangiovese, is like really rich and complex, and layers and layers, and so it would have to be jazz. Maybe maybe Miles Davis could work with that, because there's more complexity, there's more layers, and it's that might work with that.
See, it came full circle to Miles Davis.
Yeah, he had to be in the stock, I guess.
So, you've had the privilege to live other places. You lived here, and you've traveled around California, and you've, traveled around and had different wines. But I'm sure there's somewhere in the world that's at the top of your list that you want to get to next. What wine region sort of at the top of your bucket list?
There's many. There's actually, I spend a lot of time working with the wines in the U.S., in some European countries, and not much traveling wine regions. So, Burgundy. I've never been in Burgundy, and so I'd love to actually do a trip there and go and explore it. And, I've read about it, I've tasted some and everything, but I've never actually been there. So that would be up high on the list.
Yes. Well, while you start planning, because you need to plan that. You can't just wait forever. You need to start planning a trip to Burgundy. It's not that far from where you live.
No.
It's very close. But in the meantime, if somebody wanted to come and visit you, can you just remind everyone, I know you're in Agriturismo and you have a restaurant on site, but can you tell us a little bit more about how people can visit you and what's available to them?
Yeah. We have, as you said, an agriturismo. We have a bed and breakfast and apartments and a restaurant. We have cooking courses at the estate, which we've had for a long time. My mother used to teach them way back in the 80s. And so, you can have a variety of experiences there, including some great wine tastings. It's also a place, because we're high on the Chianti Hills, in the middle of the forest. It's a great place for hikes, for people that come and do bike tours. So, and it's also nice if you come in the summer to just be there as a central place to visit other parts of Tuscany. It's pretty close to Siena and Florence and Arezzo and the little villages of Chianti and the surrounding area. So there's really a variety of things that you can do there, but depends what your taste is.
I'm ready to book my trip. So what's the best way to find you? And whether it's just coming in for a tasting or to book at the bed and breakfast or at the restaurant, this all has to be done in advance. And can it be done online?
Yeah, it can be done online. Badia Coltibuono is the name of the estate, and you can find everything online. We are open from March to November, closed in the winter, and pretty much everything that you do is described, and you can book. You don't always have to book in advance, depends. There are times when it's really busy and you might want to book to make sure that there is room, but sometimes you can also last minute can find room or a table at a restaurant or a space in one of the cooking classes. So,
and to come in just for a tasting, that's also possible?
Absolutely, yes.
Great.
And because the monastery is an historical building, we also have visits open, walk-in the afternoons during the season between spring, summer, and fall. If not, you can book a tasting in advance. Many different options, and it's really a special place, quite unique, and definitely worth a visit.
Ooh. Well, it sounds like a trip to Badia Coltibuono is just a trip unto itself. And while you're saying you can explore other places, it sounds like a great place to just make camp for a couple days and enjoy. So I hope people will start planning their trips, and I hope you'll plan your trip to Burgundy and check that off the list. But Roberto, I want to thank you for joining us on Wine Soundtrack, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope to also have you at Badia Coltibuono soon.
I would love that. Grazie.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack International. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.